All right, welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're digging into a sermon that asks a pretty big question. How do you trust God in a world that feels, well, hostile? And believe it or not, the answer it finds is in the ancient story of Daniel and the lion's den. So let's get right into it. And this really is the core question, isn't it? What can a story that's thousands of years old, a story about lions, possibly teach us about living our lives today? The sermon's whole point is that this isn't just ancient history. It's a playbook, a practical guide for how to stand firm when everything around you is pushing you to compromise. Okay, so before we go any further, we have to get this key idea. When the sermon talks about Babylon, it's not just talking about the historical city. No, it's using Babylon as a metaphor. It's a symbol for the kind of world we live in right now. A world that can feel super materialistic, full of temptations, and frankly, pretty alienating if you're a person of faith. So, that brings us to the first big section. In what the sermon calls this modern Babylonian world, how do you actually live? How do you operate as an outsider without completely losing yourself in the process? Well, according to the sermon, this kind of cultural pressure pushes you toward two really dangerous temptations. On one hand, you could just collapse. You retreat, you get bitter, you feel defeated by it all. Or you go the other way. You compromise. You start shaving off bits of your beliefs just to fit in, to get that promotion, to be successful. And this is exactly why this sermon zooms in on Daniel. He's presented as the perfect example of someone who didn't fall into either of those traps. He found a third way, a path of integrity. But, as we're about to see, that path was about to be tested in the most extreme way possible. Okay, so let's look at the crisis itself. This is the moment where Daniel's private faith runs head-on into the public, absolute power of the government. So here's what happened. Daniel's enemies, they were jealous. They couldn't find any fault in his actual work, so they got sneaky. They tricked the king into signing this law, a law that couldn't be broken. And it said, for 30 days, nobody can pray to any god or man except for the king. It was a setup, plain and simple, designed specifically to trap Daniel. And we're not talking about a slap on the wrist here. The penalty for breaking this law? Being thrown into a den of lions. Just like that, his personal, private faith became a capital offense. So what do you do? I mean, really, what do you do when the thing you believe in most deeply could get you killed? How did Daniel react? He knew the law was signed. He knew his enemies were watching his every move. And this right here? This is his response. The sermon argues that this one single verse contains everything we need to know. It's not just a sentence. It's a complete blueprint for how to trust God, even when you're facing the worst pressure you can imagine. So let's break that down. The sermon unpacks this verse into what it calls a three-part blueprint for trust. These three parts are the habit of faith, the defiance of faith, and the object of faith. They all build on each other, so let's take them one by one, starting with the first one, habit. All right, first up, the habit of faith. The sermon really zeroes in on this little phrase at the end of the verse, as he did aforetime. That's just a fancy way of saying as he had always done. It was his custom, his routine, and this is such a key insight from the sermon. Daniel's courage in that moment wasn't some random, spontaneous act of heroism. It was the result of a lifelong habit. Think of it like this. His daily, disciplined prayer life was like building a strong foundation for a house. When the storm came, and boy did it come, the house stood firm. There was no panic, just consistency. And because it was such an ingrained habit, the sermon points out that Daniel didn't even have to think about it. There was no agonizing, no back and forth debate in his mind. He heard the decree, he went home, and he prayed. Simple as that. And that immediate, decisive action leads us right into the second part of the blueprint. That second part is the defiance of faith. Now, when you hear defiance, you might think of a loud, angry protest. But that's not what this was. This was a quiet, calm, conscious decision. He knew the consequences. He knew the law was set in stone. And he prayed openly anyway. The sermon's conclusion here is powerful. For Daniel, it was better to die than to be ashamed of his God or compromise who he was. But that brings up a really interesting question. Why did he pray with his windows open toward Jerusalem? I mean, at that time, Jerusalem was basically a pile of rubble. The city was destroyed. So what was he looking toward? The answer to that gives us the final piece of this blueprint. And here it is, the third pillar, the object of faith. The sermon argues this was a profoundly symbolic act. Daniel wasn't praying to the pile of rocks that was Jerusalem. He was praying toward the promise that Jerusalem represented, the promise that God would one day restore his people. And from the sermon's Christian point of view, this was an act of faith pointing forward, ultimately, to a heavenly city, to a future hope. So you have the habit, the defiance, and the object of his faith. What happens when you put all that together? What's the outcome of this incredible conviction? Well, it's a total 180-degree reversal from what looked like certain death to an unbelievable deliverance. So as the story continues, Daniel is thrown into the lion's den, and he's completely unharmed. The lions don't touch him, but his enemies, they end up facing the very fate they cooked up for him. And the king, after seeing this miracle, is so blown away that he changes his tune entirely. He issues a brand new decree telling everyone in his kingdom to respect the God of Daniel. But let's go back for a second, because this is crucial. Remember, Daniel gave thanks before he knew he would be saved. Why would he do that? The sermon argues it's because his trust was absolute. He believed that God would get glory for himself one way or another, either by a miraculous rescue from the lions or by Daniel dying a faithful death. Either way, God wins. And this brings us to the sermon's closing analogy, which is just fantastic. It describes a famous painting of a chess game. On one side, you have Satan, and he's got this smug, triumphant look on his face. He's about to say checkmate. Across from him is a young man who looks absolutely terrified, completely defeated. But the story goes that a master chess player studied this painting for hours, and he suddenly realized there was a hidden move, a move the young man couldn't see that would actually let him win the game. And that, right there, is the sermon's final point. In life, when it feels like Satan is about to call checkmate, when it looks like you're totally beaten, there is always another move on the board. There's always a way to win, a path to victory, if you trust in God to show you the move. So we come full circle, back to the beginning. We live in a world that's always asking us, pushing us to compromise a little here, a little there. And so the sermon leaves us with this one last thing to think about, a question to ask ourselves. What does your conviction look like in a world of compromise?